On a hillside near the town of Polokwane, South Africa, nearly 3,000 white crosses rise from the dry ground, row after row, stretching toward the horizon. Each cross marks a name, a date, a life ended. From above, they look like graves, thousands of them. A massacre frozen in time. In May 2025, the President of the United States dimmed the lights of the Oval Office. He pressed play on a video. The South African President Cyril Ramaphosa watched as images of this hillside filled the screen, white crosses. As far as the camera could see, President Trump leaned forward. He believed he was looking at a cemetery. Evidence of mass murder. He thrust printouts across the desk, photos of crime scenes, victims' blood. One by one, he turned the pages. Death, he said. Death, death. His message was clear. White farmers in South Africa are being hunted, killed systematically. A genocide is unfolding and the world is watching. But here's what Trump didn't know. Those crosses aren't graves, they are symbols. A memorial built over 3 decades to honor people killed in farm attacks, going back to 1994. They represent 30 years of tragedy, not 30 days, and they tell only half the story. The other half being what is missing from this hillside. That will be crosses of black South Africans, farm workers, security guards, family members, people who also died in these attacks, people whose deaths rarely make international headlines. So the question isn't whether or not violence exists in rural South Africa. It does. The question we're trying to answer here is, are white farmers being exterminated in a genocide, or is something else going on here?
Farmers are being killed. They happen to be white, but whether they're white or black makes no difference to me. But white farmers are being brutally killed and their land is being confiscated in South Africa.
Well, let's start with what we can verify. From April 2023 to March 2024, according to AfriForum, an Afrikaner civil rights group that carefully tracks these incidents, 49 people were murdered in farm attacks across South Africa. 49 lives, each one a tragedy, each one leaving behind families, communities, and fear. That same year, South Africa recorded over 26,000 murders nationwide. An average of 72 people are killed every single day. Farm-related murders represent 0.2% of that total, less than 1%. For context, in the first 3 months of 2025, there were 6 murders in South African farming areas. 1 victim was white, 5 were black. This doesn't fit the narrative you've heard. The one that says white farmers are being systematically slaughtered. The one amplified by tech billionaires, presidents, and viral social media posts. But here's what the data actually shows. South Africa is in the grip of a massive crime epidemic, and the vast majority of victims are black South Africans living in townships and informal settlements, places where police response is slow, where poverty breeds desperation, where violence has become routine. The average black South African faces a higher risk of murder than the average white South African. That is not my opinion, that is a fact. Now, it's true that white farmers have been disproportionately affected by farm attacks relative to their small population. But there is a reason for that, and it is not genocide. White South Africans make up about 7% of the population. But due to the legacy of colonialism and apartheid, they still own 72% of privately owned farmland. Black South Africans own just 4%. So when a farm is attacked, there is a high statistical likelihood that the owner will be white, because most farm owners are white. Between 1998 and 2016, at least 1,848 people were murdered in farm attacks. Most were white farmers and their relatives, but at least 147 were black farm workers. People who lived on those farms, people who were tortured, killed, and often ignored in official tallies. The South African Police Service investigated these cases. They looked for patterns, motive, coordination, and what they found repeatedly was robbery. Criminals targeting isolated properties for cash, guns, and vehicles. Opportunistic violence, not ideological extermination. In 2003, a major police inquiry concluded there was no evidence of a coordinated campaign to target victims by race. In 2015, the South African Human Rights Commission reached the same conclusion. Farm violence was part of the country's general crime problem, not a racial vendetta. No credible international authority has declared a genocide in South Africa. Not the United Nations, not even Genocide Watch, not the International Court of Justice, because Genocide, as you see, has a specific legal definition: the intentional destruction in whole or in part of a racial, ethnic, national, or religious group. It requires evidence of intent to annihilate, and that evidence simply doesn't exist, not in this case. So what does exist? We have a country with one of the highest murder rates on earth, a country where crime spares no community, a country where fear is real, but where the narrative has diverged sharply from the facts. So how did we arrive at this narrative of white genocide again? Well, to understand how we got here, you have to go back to 1994, the end of apartheid. For nearly 350 years, Black South Africans had been systematically dispossessed of their land, first by colonial powers, then by the apartheid regime. By the time Nelson Mandela became president, 87% of South African land was still owned by whites, who made up just 10% of the population. The new government promised reforms, redistribution, justice, but progress was painfully slow. By the early 2010s, whites still owned the vast majority of commercial farmland despite land reform promises. This failure created a tinderbox. Black South Africans grew frustrated, white farmers grew fearful, and when farm attacks began to spike in the late 1990s, they weren't just crime statistics, they became symbols of something deeper: unresolved grievances, historical wounds being reopened. The question of who belongs to this land. Mandela himself in 1998 called the attacks cold-blooded killings that had increased dramatically. The government formed committees, deployed special police units, but they maintained these were crimes, not political acts, robbery, not revolution. Many white farmers didn't believe that. They felt targeted, abandoned. Some even whispered that the government secretly approved of the violence. Some saw it as punishment for the sins of apartheid. And then there were the songs. During the anti-apartheid struggle, liberation movement sang something like Double Ibunu, Zulu for shoot the Boer. Boer means farmer in Afrikaans, but it came to represent white Africans, the old oppressors. After apartheid ended, the song faded, but in the late 2000s, Julius Malema, a firebrand politician, began singing it at his rallies. For white farmers, this was terrifying. A black political leader standing before crowds chanting about killing them. Courts banned the slogan in 2011 as hate speech, but it came back. In 2022, a court ruled the variant. Kill the Boer was protected political speech, a metaphor for dismantling oppression. But legal nuance doesn't matter when you are a family barricading your windows at night, when neighbors have been murdered, when politicians seem to be calling for your blood. By the early 2010s, fringe Afrikaner groups began using a new term: white genocide. It wasn't mainstream. Most farmers rejected the extremism, but the phrase took root in online forums, blogs, and international white nationalist circles. Then in 2018, it exploded. That year, South Africa's parliament began discussing land expropriation without compensation, a radical proposal to accelerate redistribution. It was controversial, debated, not yet implemented, but the international reaction was swift. Australia's Home Affairs Minister suggested offering fast-track visas to white South African farmers, calling them persecuted and in need of refuge in a civilized country. Former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott claimed 400 white farmers had been murdered in the past year. Fact checkers proved this was false. The real number was under 70, but the damage was already done. Then came August 2018. Fox News ran a segment claiming the South African government was seizing land and that there was a genocide against whites. President Donald Trump watched, and he tweeted to his over 50 million followers. He had instructed his Secretary of State to investigate, quote, the large-scale killing of farmers in South Africa. The South African government was blindsided. They issued sharp rebuttals. The narrative was false, they said, distorted, dangerous, but it was too late. The story had gone global. White nationalist websites celebrated. AfriForum sent representatives to the United States and Europe, meeting with sympathetic politicians, appearing on talk shows that showed maps covered in pins, each one a farm attack, images of elderly victims, burned homes, tortured families. The message was quite clear at this point. This is what happens when whites lose power. A warning to the West. By the 2020s, the narrative had congealed into weapon. Elon Musk, born in South Africa, tweeted support. American Republican congressmen wrote letters urging refugee status for white farmers. Far-right media outlets ran story after story. White genocide in South Africa became a rallying cry alongside conspiracy theories about migrant invasions in Europe and white replacement in America. And then Trump returned to office. In February 2025, he signed an executive order halting all US aid to South Africa. In May, 59 white South Africans arrived in the United States as refugees. By October, the White House announced that most of America's 7,500 refugee slots for the year will be reserved for Afrikaners, people fleeing what the administration called illegal or unjust discrimination. This was unprecedented. US policy explicitly shaped by the claim that white South Africans faced persecution, rising to the level of genocide. In November, Trump called South Africa's hosting of the G20 summit a disgrace. He declared no US officials would attend. His reason was that Afrikaners were being killed and their land confiscated, except no large-scale land confiscation had occurred. The expropriation law existed on paper but hadn't been implemented. President Ramaphosa, sitting across from Trump in that dimmed Oval Office, responded calmly, "There is just no genocide in South Africa." But by then, the truth didn't matter. The narrative had escaped the realm of facts. It had become ideological mythology.
You know, I'm not going to, we have a G20 meeting in South Africa. South Africa shouldn't even be in the Gs anymore because what's happened there is bad. I'm not going. I told him I'm not going.
For white farmers still living in South Africa, this global attention had been both validating and terrifying. On one hand, they feel seen, heard. On the other, if you truly believe a genocide is coming, that's not just fear, that is existential dread. Some have sold their land and emigrated. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United States even. Small communities of resettled Afrikaner farmers convinced they were fleeing extermination. And for those who remain, they have turned their properties into fortresses. Electric fences, armed patrols, panic rooms. Farmers coordinate nighttime shifts, driving perimeter roads with rifles and walkie-talkies. Children are taught to hide at the first sound of gunfire. This is real. The fear, the trauma, the sleepless nights, all of it is real. But for Black South Africans, farm workers, rural residents, township families, the white genocide narrative feels like erasure. They ask, why does the world care about white farmers and not us? Why do 49 deaths spark international outrage when 26,000 murders barely register? Why are our names not on those white crosses? Black farm workers have been tortured and killed in the same attacks. Black communities face gang violence, poverty, and structural neglect. The average Black South African is statistically more likely to be murdered than the average white South African. But their stories don't trend. Their deaths don't reach the Oval Office. And when they demand land reform, when they ask for justice after centuries of dispossession, their grievances are recast as genocidal intent. The narrative becomes a weapon against them, used to delegitimize their claims, to paint them as enemies in a race war. This is what the white genocide myth does. It polarizes, it distorts, it pits communities against each other when they should be united against crime, inequality, and a broken system. And it also travels. The South African farm murder story has been absorbed into a global far-right mythology, the Great Replacement conspiracy. The idea that white people are being systematically exterminated worldwide. And this belief has inspired violence. The Charleston church shooter immersed himself in online propaganda about black on white crime and white genocide before killing 9 people. The Christchurch terrorist wrote a manifesto titled The Great Replacement before murdering 51 Muslim worshippers. You see, when public figures like Trump legitimize the white genocide narrative, they validate the worldview that drives extremists to kill. And for what? To score political points, to stoke culture wars, to use a distant country's pain as a prop in domestic battles, South Africa becomes a pawn. Its sovereignty undermined, its complexity flattened into a meme. And here's the truth stripped of propaganda and politics. South Africa has a violent crime crisis. It affects everyone, black and white, urban and rural, rich and poor. Farm attacks are a subset of this broader epidemic, driven primarily by robbery, isolation, and opportunism. White farmers are disproportionately affected as farm owners because of historical land ownership patterns. Black farm workers are also victims, though their deaths are often underreported. The South African government, for all its flaws, has implemented rural safety strategies. 99% of designated rural police stations now coordinate with farm associations and labor unions. Progress is slow, yes, but it exists. And no genocide is taking place, not by any credible definition, not according to any legitimate authority. So the hillside of white crosses you see represent 30 years of tragedy, real violence, real loss, but it's been stripped of context and weaponized into a story that serves agendas far beyond South Africa's borders. The crosses don't tell the whole story. They never did, because they only count some of the dead. And when we reduce human tragedy to propaganda, when we mistake crime for conspiracy, fear for fact, we don't just fail the victims. We poison any chance of finding real solutions. South Africa deserves better. Its farmers, black and white, deserve safety. Its workers deserve dignity. Its future deserves honesty. The real question here was never whether the violence exists. It does. The question is, who benefits when we call it a genocide?